A pleasure to be here with Lucy Hannah. Welcome, ma'am, to the Kolkata Literature Festival. First of all, let's start by talking about the session that you're going to be part of, a session which calls itself the Identity Quotient. So, when we look at identity today, there are so many fragments, there are so many divisions. Do you think that generally, as a culture, as part of how we understand ourselves, we are becoming more polarized and divided? Or is it because now we've got a forum, a way of expressing our divisions, that it seems like we are more divided, whereas in reality, this is actually how we've been all along?
Gosh, I think, well, can I just preface this by saying that my work in particular, or the company that I work for, specializes in working with writers who are marginalized by community or conflict. And so I suppose we're in a way looking for people who are polarized and marginalized. I'm not sure if polarized interprets as marginalized, but so I think in a way we're becoming generally probably more polarized, but it seems as though we're not, because of the internet and so forth, is good at covering up the cracks, or can be good at covering up the cracks. But I think our job as facilitators, publishers, literary agents, writers, translators, is to work as hard as possible to change the, to part the grass for those who may feel marginalized within a polarized world, and do whatever we can to shift gatekeeping so it's not in the sort of majority or minority north and the obvious places. And the ways to do that is to increase the amount of, for example, literary work that is translated, and boost the status of translators worldwide, and encourage readers to use literature to really take a step into other people's shoes, wherever they might be on both sides.
As part of the work that you've been doing for Untold Narratives, in the literature that you represent, or in the literature that people from marginalized backgrounds write, are there any overarching themes that you've noticed, particularly in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia, themes or subjects or ideas that recur across cultures, across countries?
Well, the book that we'll be talking about today is called My Pen is the Wing of a Bird, and this is fiction by Afghan women, contemporary Afghan women. And certainly there are themes that, even though this is fiction, the themes are really very real, and they spring often from real life experiences. And I think that is often the case. So, for example, a woman giving birth to her 8th child, who happens to be another daughter, when her husband wanted a son, or rural life, particularly for women, which is particularly hard. So I think using real life I think it's very difficult to get away from real life when it's particularly challenging. And on the other hand, when you're living in a regime that is uncertain and unpredictable, using fiction as a way to address and explore reality is a really great tool to have.
Can you also talk a little bit about the other book that you have, if you can maybe point it to the camera as well?
Of course. So this is particularly relevant for today at the Calcutta Book Fair Literary Festival, a festival of moonlight. This is Stories from Assam, and there are 14 stories here in translation into English, but written by Assamese writers. So this was a collaboration between my company Untold and B Books here in Calcutta, who've published this edition, and also 14 writers from across Assam. So B and Untold worked together very closely with Arunava Singer, who was our translator mentor, who I'm sure all your listeners will know, who is fantastic, and Mitra Pukkan, who is an editor in Assam. So together as a team, with 3 local translators as well, who worked very closely with Aranava. We collaborated very literally in that writer, editor, translator worked closely together through various drafts. So these are emerging writers. These aren't established writers, although there are 4 stories in here from more experienced writers. And we created this new work. And the idea is really because it's very difficult if you are writing in Assamese to get your work out beyond the boundaries, if you like, to a wider national and global audience. And we are looking for a local Assamese publisher as well, obviously, because to honour the work in the original language.
As part of a fistful of moonlight, as part of the editing process, what would you say were the biggest challenges for yourself personally? And what were the insights that kind of took you aback that maybe you didn't quite expect this to come out of a particular story or about just the landscape of Assam in general?
Well, I think we go back to real life actually, because the 3, for me, 2 or 3 of the most powerful pieces in here were inspired by real life incidents. So the oil rig fire in, probably won't pronounce it right, Bagjan. That is a very powerful piece that's been turned into a piece of fiction, and also communities being moved on who were settled by a particular lake area, who were unable to put down roots anywhere because they kept being moved on by the local authorities. And those 2, for example, are inspired by real life, but they are pieces of fiction. And I think it was surprising how the reality came through again, although there are other pieces that go far from reality. There's also a retelling of a folk tale about now you may have to just cut for a minute, yes, the retelling of a folk tale about Tejimola's stepmother, which is a really interesting modern take on that folk tale.
Wonderful. Returning to the question of identity and polarization, do you feel that literature has a very important role in making sure that a lot of these identities and the gaps between them are bridged, that we create sense of sympathy, that we create a sense of, if not a uniformity or a unity, but the idea that, look, you can be different and still get along with each other? Because increasingly we are seeing that the world is getting more narrow-minded, right? Especially with the rise of social media, bipartisanship, as a political philosophy, as a cultural philosophy, is on the decline. So where do you see the role of literature in sort of serving as an anchor for that and getting people together to cooperate?
I think it's vital. It's one of the main pillars of that changing of attitudes. And that comes back to local literary and creative infrastructures being available, editors locally, translators locally, and in many parts of the world that is not the case. So in Afghanistan that's not the case, certainly not now, and in Assam there aren't many local literary editors who can work with new and emerging writers, and there isn't a very large, robust publishing infrastructure like there is, say, here in Kolkata. So the more that the more that people operating internationally can do to collaborate with partners in different countries to spread the word, if you like, to get these books like this translated into different languages. This one is now in Japanese, it's in Korean, it's just being published in Iceland, it's in German, and we have great hopes for this one, which will be coming out in the UK in September this year. So that's the key, really. If you can't read it in your own language, then
My final question is going to be on a slightly different tangent. I'm going to talk to you about the BBC. The BBC has been in the news in India in the last couple of weeks because of a documentary it has released on the Prime Minister. And for us sitting back in India, we have all sorts of narratives about the BBC that apparently it is in crisis, apparently it has lost its independence. But for someone like yourself, who's of course worked with the BBC for so many years and nevertheless followed its activities even though you're no longer a part of it, what do you make of the BBC currently? Where does it stand in the UK? Is it really in a crisis right now?
Well, I worked for it a long time ago, and I haven't worked for it for 20 years, so I'm out of date. However, I do watch it, and I know people who do work in it. Personally, I'm passionate about BBC Radio. I'm passionate about BBC World Service, which is one of the pillars of the BBC, and I think that remains a sort of jewel in the crown, as it were, that people still don't respect enough in the UK, actually. As far as television goes, I think there are big debates going on about the funding for television and the fact that there are so many streaming channels now. So there are a competition like there never was before. So in that way, the BBC's got to, compete with the best of them, as it were. But in a way, my response is definitely sort of the BBC Radio should be preserved forever because it's something that really is unique and special. Television, I'm not so sure about, so we'll see.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Have a lovely time at KLF.
Thank you for having me.